being bound, and then we saw the duct tape, and we knew that whatever or whoever had done this, it was something we weren't used to dealing with.
50 states, 50 disturbing stories, 7 layers. This is an iceberg made of the most disturbing things to happen in every U.S. state. We'll start with some of the most well-known stories and slowly dig into some of the most horrific stories you've ever heard of. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. New Mexico, Roswell. In June 1947, rancher W.W. Mac Brazel discovered some strange debris scattered across his New Mexico property near Roswell. Lightweight, metallic fragments, balsa wood, and tinfoil-like material. He immediately alerted authorities, prompting Roswell Army Airfield personnel to retrieve the wreckage. On July 8th, the Air Force announced the recovery of a flying disc, igniting global speculation as to what exactly that meant. Within just 24 hours, those same officials reversed course, claiming it was nothing more than a crashed weather balloon, a story that held for decades. But decades later, witnesses emerged with contradictory accounts. Retired Major Jesse Marcel, who oversaw the initial recovery, insisted in the 1970s that the debris was not of this Earth, and then the military staged photos with balloon materials to hide the truth from the public. Other witnesses described a larger crash site with alien bodies, small, hairless humanoids, which were allegedly transported to Area 51. But skeptics dismissed these as confused, mixed-up memories of Cold War-era experiments, such as Project Mogul, a classified program using high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. The U.S. Air Force's 1997 report of the incident said that the alien bodies were actually just parachute test dummies dropped in the 1950s, yet gaps in the story are still unexplained and might never be answered. Arkansas, the Duggars. In 2008, TLC aired a brand new reality show, 19 Kids and Counting, which introduced the world to the Duggars, a family of devout independent Baptists from Arkansas. The show portrayed their life with 19 children under strict religious principles rooted in the Institute and Basic Life Principles, and it was a hit. Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar soon leveraged their huge platform to advocate for conservative political causes they believed in, including campaigns against LGBTQ+ rights in Arkansas. But behind this curated image, their eldest son Josh had a secret. He had murdered 5 minors between 2002 and 2003, including 4 sisters aged between 5 and 11, all while his parents concealed the abuse and sent him to an unlicensed religious training program. The case had actually gone to police years earlier in 2006, but the investigation was derailed when Jim Bob and Michelle refused to cooperate. When the statutes of limitation expired, authorities ultimately dropped the case, allowing them to get away with it. Until 2015. In Touch Weekly exposed the police report revealing Josh's crimes and the Duggars' cover-up and prompting TLC to cancel 19 Kids and Counting. Unwilling to let their empire fall, the Duggars attempted a rebrand with the spin-off Counting On, but Josh's 2021 federal conviction for possessing child sexual abuse materials, for which he's currently serving a 12-year prison sentence, ended the franchise entirely. But the Duggars had more trouble to come. Former family members, including daughter Jill Duggar, alleged financial exploitation and emotional manipulation tied to the reality TV enterprise. And internal IBLP documents and survivor accounts subsequently revealed systemic abuse patterns within the organization the Duggars promoted. So, all around, they were in some shady company. Utah, Ted Bundy. In 1974, a pattern emerged across the Pacific Northwest. Young women, often college students with long dark hair, vanished after encounters with a charming man named Ted. Witnesses described a Volkswagen Beetle and a suspect feigning injuries to exploit victims' empathy. This man was Ted Bundy, now recognized as one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. After relocating to Utah in 1975, Bundy was arrested following a traffic stop that uncovered handcuffs, ropes, and a ski mask, all tools linked to kidnapping. Given the extensive number of women disappearing after their encounters with him, he had no defense. But even though he was convicted of aggravated kidnapping, he escaped Colorado custody twice in 1977, fleeing to Florida. There, in January 1978, he infiltrated a Florida State University sorority house, bludgeoning and strangling 2 students and assaulting 2 others. Hours later, he attacked another student, leaving her permanently disabled. He simply could not stop. His spree came to an end weeks later with the abduction of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, whom he raped and murdered. His stolen vehicle led to his final arrest in Pensacola, where forensic evidence sealed his conviction for the sorority murders. By the time of his 1989 execution, he had confessed to 30 killings, though experts speculate the true toll exceeded 100. Ohio, Oxford Lights. A long time ago in Oxford, Ohio, a farmer's daughter had a boyfriend, but her father didn't approve of him or their relationship. He forbade her from going to see him, but she couldn't resist. So the couple came up with a signal, a 3-flash light, to coordinate their late-night meetings. But the girl's father found out what was going on and crashed the meeting. In his panic to get away, the boyfriend tried to speed away on his motorcycle, only to crash into a barbed wire fence, which decapitated him. Decades later, it said that people at the intersection of Old Milford and Earhart Road can encounter the restless spirit of that boy. Supposedly, when people park at the intersection and flash their car lights 3 times, they can wait to see a distinct orb-like glow that approaches before vanishing. Some witnesses also have described other things, like faint screams, floating red lights resembling bike reflectors, or brief appearances of emergency vehicle flares. The incident has never been confirmed, but the ritual persists as a local tradition, particularly among students who want to see if the phantom biker shows up. Kansas, tornadoes. On May 4, 2007, a 1.7-mile-wide EF5 tornado with 205-mile-per-hour winds obliterated 95% of Greensburg, Kansas, marking the first EF5-rated tornado in history under the newly implemented enhanced Fujita scale. At 9:45 p.m., the storm hit, leveling 1,400 homes and businesses, killing 11 people and injuring 63. Survivors described scenes resembling a bomb blast, with neighborhoods reduced to debris fields and critical infrastructure like hospitals severely damaged. The damage was so intense that it drove Greensburg to redevelop itself into a model of sustainability, with rebuilt energy-efficient structures and a community-led green initiative. Yet, while this EF5 was a historic meteorological milestone, it wasn't the state's deadliest tornado. That remains the 1955 Udall F5, which killed 80 people in 3 minutes without even a slight warning. The EF5 gave residents 26 minutes to evacuate, but it wasn't enough to ensure the safety of the residents. Level 2. Michigan, Jimmy Hoffa. James Jimmy Hoffa rose from a Detroit warehouse worker to president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters by 1957, but he quickly used his power for improper purposes. While leading the union, he had forged a series of alliances with organized crime to combat corporate opposition. Within a matter of years, the Teamsters Pension Fund became a $1.5 billion financial tool for mob-backed Las Vegas casino projects. But it was all about to come crashing down. In 1957, Hoffa was summoned before the Senate on a bribery charge, a case that was intensified under Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's Get Hoffa campaign. Everybody wanted him in prison, and he was running out of ways to avoid it. He was ultimately convicted in 1964 of jury tampering and pension fund fraud, serving 5 years before President Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971. And then he vanished. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa vanished from a Bloomfield Township, Michigan restaurant parking lot. He was there for a meeting with Detroit mob figure Anthony Giancolone and New Jersey crime boss Anthony Provenzano. Witnesses saw him pacing near his car, which was found unlocked and abandoned the next morning. The Anthonys were both suspects in his presumed murder. The FBI has always believed that the Mafia ordered his killing to prevent his attempted Teamster comeback, fearing he'd expose their control of union funds. Despite decades of searches, including a 2022 excavation at a New Jersey landfill, no physical evidence has surfaced. Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982, but what happened remains a mystery. Alaska, Portlock Ghost Town. In 1950, the former cannery and mining settlement of Portlock, Alaska was losing a lot of residents. The town was becoming abandoned, and all because of decades of creepy things. Back in the early 1900s, the town was new, but by 1905, a group of Native Alaskan cannery workers temporarily fled due to an unspecified threat in the surrounding forests. Nobody knows what they saw, but it creeped them out enough to want to get the hell out of there. By the 1930s, more reports came, and they were escalating. A logger named Andrew Kamluck was found dead in 1931 with a fatal head injury inflicted by equipment far too heavy for a human to wield. His body was discovered just 10 feet away from the blood-stained machinery. Hunters were already in the woods looking for moose, and they claimed to have discovered 18-inch humanoid footprints and signs of a violent struggle in the brush. Now, everyone was convinced there was a sinister creature on the loose, which the locals called Nantinaq, a Sasquatch-like figure. The 1940s continued the trend, with mutilated bodies appearing in nearby lagoons, including a hunter whose dismembered remains showed injuries consistent with bear attacks. One fisherman described seeing a towering, hairy figure on a beach that stared him down before retreating into the wilderness. By 1950, the constant killings and disappearances took its toll on the locals. They wanted out. Nearly all residents relocated to neighboring villages, leaving only the postmaster until the office's closure in 1950. Official records have long claimed that the town's isolation from Alaska Route 1 was the primary cause of abandonment, but survivors maintained that something in the woods drove them out. They just don't know what. New Hampshire, Betty and Barney Hill. Betty and Barney Hill, a couple from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, were driving home from a Canadian vacation on September 19, 1961. As they drove through the White Mountains, they saw a bright, erratic light tracking their car. It became so confusing and distracting that they eventually stopped to investigate fully, but that's when Barney saw a disc-shaped craft. According to him, he saw humanoid figures in uniforms watching them through binoculars, and that was enough for them to flee back to the car in a panic. When they arrived home, it was 5 a.m., but given when they left, traffic and other circumstances, they should have arrived at 2 a.m. Somehow, they lost 2 hours of time. Then, they noticed Betty's torn dress, Barney's scuffed shoes, and the unexplained circles on their car. For the next month, Betty reported vivid dreams of being examined by gray-skinned beings so realistic they felt like memories. The couple underwent hypnosis with a psychiatrist 2 years later when they described being left aboard a spaceship, separated and subjected to medical tests including skin scrapings, needle probes, and a pregnancy test. Betty claimed the beings showed her a star map which one astronomer later interpreted as the Zeta Reticuli system. Their case spurred a 2,500% increase in abduction reports and remains a critical piece of evidence in UFO circles. Montana, Blackfeet Flood. In early June 1964, a storm system collided with Montana's late-season mountain snowpack, triggering catastrophic flooding across the state. Heavy snowfall and below-average temperatures meant that the snow didn't melt, saturating the soil. A rare storm dumped up to 13 inches of rain on top, creating a deluge that overwhelmed Swift and Two Medicine dams, both earth-based structures built in 1912, causing both to collapse. Residents received no formal warnings of what was coming. The phone lines failed, and radio alerts came too late. Swift Dam's 10:10 a.m. breach unleashed a 40-foot wall of water that swept through Blackfeet Reservation communities before they even knew what was going on. Entire families were caught in the surge as homes disintegrated. 31 people died, including 19 from a single extended family. The flood destroyed over 260 homes, washed out bridges, and stranded survivors without supplies for days, with 20% of Montana affected. Butch Newbreast, then 14, lost his parents and toddler sister in the disaster. Their bodies were never recovered. Now in his 70s, Newbreast often rides Birch Creek's banks near the former dam site, scanning the eroded landscape for traces of his family. Pennsylvania, Centralia. On May 27, 1962, the thriving coal mining community of Centralia, Pennsylvania, had its worst day in history. During a routine landfill cleanup, a controlled trash fire ignited an exposed coal seam beneath the site. Despite their best efforts to contain it, the fire spread through the abandoned mine tunnels, fueled by an estimated 25 million tons of coal. It would continue to burn for years, threatening the peace of the 1,500 residents. By the 1970s, the fire caused hazardous conditions including ground subsidence, toxic gas emissions, and sinkholes. And then came the health issues. Air quality tests revealed dangerous carbon monoxide levels, and a 1986 health study linked residents' respiratory issues, hypertension, and chronic stress to the fire. The fire was never going to stop, and it was only making everybody sick. The U.S. government allocated $42 million in 1983 to relocate residents, with most accepting buyouts by 1984. By 1991, Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain, condemning properties and reducing the population from 1,000 to 63. And by 2020, only 5 residents remained in a town that nobody could even get to. Today, overgrown streets and cracked asphalt mark the abandoned town, with steam vents and skeletal trees lining the homes of former residents. Experts have projected the fire could burn for 250 years, making the likelihood of more residents low. Connecticut, first witch execution. On May 26, 1647, Ulsa Young of Windsor, Connecticut, became the first recorded person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. At the time, a deadly influenza outbreak had devastated Windsor, killing numerous children, including those near her home. It's believed that her childless woman status, which really just meant that she only had a daughter and not a son, as well as her potential inheritance rights to her husband's property, made her a target. The local community believed she was a witch guilty of the epidemic, and she had to be punished accordingly. Connecticut's 1642 law used biblical passages to justify and mandate death for witchcraft, despite absolutely no evidence. So when that May Day came, Ulsa was hanged before her peers despite her pleas for mercy. 3 decades later, Ulsa's daughter, Alice Young Beeman, faced witchcraft accusations of her own in Springfield, Massachusetts. Her husband had died, and locals immediately accused her of continuing her mother's alleged work. Alice wasn't hanged, but only because her son successfully sued for defamation, barely preventing formal charges. Centuries later, Windsor's town council unanimously exonerated Ulsa Young and other witches, citing the injustice of the trials. She was later pardoned of all her alleged crimes. Hawaii. Volcanoes. In November 1790, Hawaii's Kilauea, one of the world's most active volcanoes, ignited a violent explosive eruption which generated pyroclastic surges, hot, fast-moving mixtures of gas and volcanic debris that killed between 400 and 800 people. The victims were mostly Hawaiian warriors and their families caught in the summit area. By 1919, their footprints were discovered preserved in ash near the summit. To this day, it remains the highest death toll from any volcanic event in U.S. history. But Kilauea was not a one and done. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Kilauea's eruptions shifted to lava flows, but they still killed. In 1924, an explosive ejected rock weighing up to 14 tons killed one person. The 1990 eruption obliterated 100 homes, a church, and a historic black sand beach. The 2018 eruption destroyed 716 homes, Hawaii's largest freshwater lake, and reshaped coastal communities in the surrounding area. The volcano has never been dormant, and while it has never been as violent as that November day in 1790, locals are convinced it's only a matter of time. California, the Zodiac Killer. On December 20th, 1968, teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were at a lover's lane in Northern California when a strange man approached them and shot them dead in their cars. Just 7 months later, Darlene Ferrin was killed, with Michael Majou surviving multiple gunshot wounds in a similar ambush. Police were already struggling to make sense of the case, but then the killer came forward, calling the police to claim responsibility and introduce himself as the Zodiac Killer. The killer continued his violent crime spree over the next year, with survivors only being able to recall one detail. He was wearing a hood marked with his signature crossed circle symbol. Investigators and journalists were working together to solve the mystery, but the killer was taunting them, sending cryptic ciphers and pieces of evidence that gave only small hints. The letters claimed responsibility for 37 murders, though only 7 confirmed victims survived or died in his attacks. For decades, FBI and police have tried to solve the case and have routinely failed to find any concrete links. The case is still classified as active to this day, with multiple ciphers still unsolved. North Carolina, Blackbeard. On November 22, 1718, British Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard was finally ready to ambush the pirate Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, on the water near Ocracoke Island, North Carolina. Maynard's 2 ships, the Jane and the Ranger, cornered Blackbeard's vessel Queen Anne's Revenge at dawn. But Blackbeard was not one to go down without a fight. When he realized what was going on, Blackbeard immediately opened fire with a broadside, forcing the Ranger onto a sandbar and preventing it from moving. Maynard pressed forward on board the Jane, concealing most of his 35-man crew below decks, hoping to stage an ambush against the most feared pirate on the open sea. As the ships closed, Blackbeard hurled grenades onto the Jane before leading 14 pirates aboard, exactly according to Maynard's plan. On cue, Maynard's hidden armada erupted from the hold, launching a closed-quarters melee. Blackbeard sustained 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 blade injuries during the 6-minute fight before collapsing dead. The most intimidating pirate had fallen. Maynard severed Blackbeard's head, suspending it from the Jane's bowsprit as proof of his victory. The grisly trophy was later displayed on a pole at Hampton's river entrance for years to ward off other pirates from attempting to cause trouble in the region. Blackbeard's headless corpse was thrown overboard, with legends claiming it circled the ship 7 times before sinking, and today it's said that parts of the sunken Queen Anne's Revenge are still being found. New York, Amityville Horror House. On November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed his parents, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters in their Amityville, New York home at 112 Ocean Avenue. The victims were found face down in their beds, each struck by .35 caliber rifle fire between 3 and 3:30 a.m. When police questioned him, DeFeo initially claimed a mob hitman committed the murder, but he changed his story within a day, confessing, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop." In 1975, he was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. But 13 months after, George and Kathy Lutz purchased the house for $80,000, and they soon came to regret it. They started experiencing unexplained phenomena, including waking at 3:15 a.m., the time of the DeFeo killings, seeing green slime oozing from walls, levitating objects, and encountering a pig-like entity their daughter called Jody. The family called in a priest to bless the house, but the priest allegedly heard a voice demanding he leave. The family lived in that house for just 28 days before detailing their story in a book, The Amityville Horror, which later inspired films and documentaries. It's not known if their story was true, but the house continues to draw the curiosity of supernatural seekers. And if you're curious to see more disturbing icebergs like this one, just hit that like and subscribe button and we'll make it happen. Level 3. Louisiana. Ronald Dominique. Between 1997 and 2006, Ronald Joseph Dominique, also known as the Bayou Strangler, murdered at least 23 men and boys across Louisiana. Ronald would pose as a truck driver seeking out vulnerable victims, African Americans, homeless, or those involved in drugs. He'd offer them money, drugs, or group sex, then lure them to trailers or remote areas before binding and strangling them with items like seat belts or extension cords. Over time, his crimes escalated with bodies discovered in sugarcane fields, under highways, and in canals. Authorities found semen on the victims, but the DNA testing process was so full of delays that it made it increasingly difficult to pin the crimes on any one person. But in 2006, one of Ronald's survivors, Ricky Wallace, reported his attacker's failed attempt to bind him during a drug deal. Sure enough, the investigators were able to match the DNA from a 2004 victim of Ronald, leading to his arrest. During interrogation, Ronald confessed to 23 killings but claimed he only acted in self-defense against robbers, all while detailing his methods of rape. He described dumping bodies in rural parishes and showed no remorse, even bragging about his crimes. His story made no sense, and he clearly enjoyed what he had done. He was ultimately charged with multiple life sentences. North Dakota, San Haven Sanatorium. In 1912, the San Haven Sanatorium was established in Dunseith, North Dakota, to help treat tuberculosis patients with rest, fresh air, and diet-based therapies. But by the 1940s, antibiotics reduced TB cases, making the facility pretty much useless. So the sanatorium shifted, repurposing itself for the developmentally disabled and mentally ill from overcrowded institutions. They got a lot more patients, more than they ever had before. But as the patient population surged, the conditions took a sharp downturn. Wards were now holding up to triple their capacity due to the severe overcrowding. Residents were forced to endure noisy, tile-lined dormitories with nothing to entertain them or fill their time, leading to many residents self-harming, banging their heads against the wall. But the staff was also seriously lacking in numbers, forced to prioritize janitorial tasks over dealing with the patients. Allegations of abuse and mismanagement quickly started to rise. Former employees denied mistreatment, but court documents cited incidents of resident-on-resident violence and occasional staff misconduct. And when they saw the state of the residents, there was no denying it. A 1985 federal court order forced San Haven's closure in 1987. It was never reopened or redeveloped. Kentucky. Kentucky Meat Shower. On March 3, 1876, Bath County, Kentucky experienced one of history's most baffling meteorological anomalies, a shower of meat. At approximately 11 a.m., farmer's wife Mary Crouch was out running errands when she happened to notice strange, sinister chunks of flesh, ranging from flakes to 4-inch squares, falling from a cloudless sky. When she reported it, the authorities thought she was crazy. But then, more and more witnesses came forward backing up her story. They described the substance as resembling beef, venison, or mutton with a grisly texture and a metallic odor. Samples were recovered and sent to laboratories with initial analyses suggesting it was nostoc bacteria, but microscopic examinations later identified lung tissue, muscle, and cartilage, suggesting the meat was potentially from a horse or human infant. When two locals tasted the meat, they compared it to lamb or deer, making it even more complicated to try and understand. There's no real understanding of what happened here, even today. Some have claimed the event was an act of divine intervention, others think it's some atmospheric issue, vultures regurgitating meat mid-flight, or even just one big hoax. But there's no proof of any of these suggestions, making this one very, very unusual freak incident. New Jersey, The Watcher. In June 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased a $1.3 million home at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. But before they moved in, they received an anonymous letter addressed to the new owner from someone identifying as The Watcher, an unidentified person with generational ties to the house who said it was their job to watch and wait for the home's second coming. The letter noted the home's 110-year history, threatening their children as young blood and criticizing renovations to a house that has spanned generations. The family thought it was weird but dismissed it as a strange prank. However, the letters kept coming, and they got more and more intense. The writer constantly misspelled the family's surname but detailed an intense knowledge of their movements and warning of hidden secrets within the house's walls that had kept for generations. The couple gave the letters to the police, who advised them to keep it a secret while investigating the neighbors as suspects. However, this was not a new thing. The previous owners, John and Andrea Woods, also received a similar letter before selling the house, but they too dismissed it as a prank. DNA evidence from the envelope's saliva identified that a woman had a hand in this, but all of the most likely suspects had been eliminated quickly. The letters freaked the family out so much that they never actually occupied the home they had bought, choosing to rent it out before selling at a $400,000 loss. For the owners that bought the house next, there were no more letters. But the case remained unsolved, with theories ranging from jealous buyers to the Broadduses themselves. Alabama, Thomas Whisenant. In 1963, 72-year-old Lexi Haynes was murdered in Alabama, shot by an unknown man. Her murder was a total mystery to authorities, who couldn't find anybody with a credible reason to shoot her. But in fact, the killer had no motive. Thomas Warren Whisenant was just a psychopath. Initially, his killings were much like this one. He would kill women and leave. But as his serial killing habits developed, his crimes escalated in brutality, leading him to mutilate these women after death and create elaborate cover-ups. His killings continued throughout Alabama until 1976. In April 1976, Whisenant abducted 23-year-old convenience store clerk Cheryl Lynn Payton, transporting her to an abandoned Mobile County shack where he killed her and left the scene of the crime. But he returned the following day to disfigure her corpse as he usually did. However, he had gotten so comfortable and cocky that his moves were getting sloppier. His constant returning to the bodies for post-killing mutilation led witnesses to see him, including police officers. Whisenant confessed to 4 murders during interrogation, though he stood trial only for 1 killing. Despite overturned convictions and sentencing appeals, he was executed by lethal injection in 2010 after 32 years on Alabama's death row. Vermont, the Bennington Triangle. The Bennington Triangle, a region in southwestern Vermont, isn't extremely well known, but it's one of the most notorious spots in the state, known for a cluster of unexplained disappearances between 1945 and 1950. In November 1945, Mitty Rivers, a 74-year-old hunting guide who was very familiar with the terrain, disappeared near Bickford Hollow while leading a group. Authorities and locals banded together to search for him, but only his handkerchief was recovered. Just 1 year later, 18-year-old student Paula Weldon vanished while hiking the Long Trail. Witnesses last saw her wearing a red jacket near Route 9, but neither her body nor belongings were found despite a $5,000 reward and FBI involvement. By this point, residents were growing uneasy, unsure if there was a killer on the loose or something less human in nature. But then, 3 years later, James Tedford, a World War II veteran, disappeared from a moving bus en route to Bennington. Passengers saw him on the bus. Yet somehow he vanished between stops, leaving behind only his luggage and ticket. Everyone saw him get on. Nobody saw him get off. For centuries, Native American legends warned of the region's cursed nature, citing erratic winds and sinkholes that often saw people disappear without explanation. To this day, no practical explanation has ever been able to justify all of these incidents. Oklahoma, toxic ghost town. Fisher, Oklahoma emerged in 1913 as a lead and zinc mining boomtown, a hotspot that saw its population explode to over 14,000 by 1926. At its peak, the town supplied half the metals for U.S. ammunition during World War I, with 10 million pounds of ore processed every single day. But by the 1970s, the abandoned mines left behind 178 million tons of toxic chat piles, crumbling lead-laden waste, and acidic-contaminated groundwater which turned nearby Tar Creek rust red. By 1994, federal tests revealed catastrophic levels of pollution. 35% of Fisher's children showed dangerous lead levels linked to developmental disorders and severe health problems. Winds carried the toxic dust from the chat piles, spreading airborne lead concentration 2 to 5 times higher than nearby cities. Despite the Environmental Protection Agency offering to pay for residents to relocate, roughly 500 residents remained by 2008. They were about to get a very, very painful shock. On May 10, 2008, an EF4 tornado with 175 mile-per-hour winds tore through the town, flattening 160 homes and killing 6 people. The storm collapsed the mine shafts, prompting emergency evacuations and accelerating federal buyouts as the toxicity became even more pronounced. By September 2009, Fisher's municipal status dissolved, its water tower standing among overgrown lots and unstable chat piles. Today, nobody lives in Fisher. It's a true ghost town. Maine, the Nottingham Galley. On December 11, 1710, the British merchant ship Nottingham Galley wrecked on Boone Island, a barren rock 6 miles off York, Maine, during a storm. All 14 crew members survived the initial crash, but now they faced sub-zero temperatures, no shelter, and minimal salvaged food. They had nothing but waterlogged cheese from their cargo. For 24 days, they were stranded there, forced to huddle together under a sailcloth tent as frostbite and starvation set in. The ship's cook died within days, and the carpenter lost his life not long after. With no fire to cook or warm themselves, Captain John Dean, a former butcher, took to extreme measures to help people. He butchered the dead carpenter's body, removing identifying features before distributing the raw flesh to the crew. Now knowing that it was only a matter of time before they also got killed and eaten, the sailors worked harder to escape via makeshift rafts, but it failed. 2 volunteers drowned, their bodies later washing ashore. Locals discovered the dead bodies and realized what was happening. On January 4th, 1711, a rescue team led by fisherman John Stover reached the island, finding 7 emaciated survivors described as skin and bone with wild, staring eyes. 10 men ultimately survived. But the crew members began to grow suspicious, convinced that the captain had intentionally wrecked the ship to claim an insurance payout, and pivoted to killing and eating the crew out of desperation and poor judgment. Nobody knows whether or not the captain intended to do that, but today, the wreckage of the Nottingham Galley remains on Boone Island. Minnesota, smiley face killer. In 2002, University of Minnesota student Chris Jenkins vanished after a Halloween party. His body was found 4 months later in the Mississippi River, initially deemed an accidental drowning. But retired NYPD detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte disagreed. They had been investigating similar cases since 1997 and identified some major inconsistencies. Jenkins' hands were folded unnaturally, and a smiley face graffiti was found at the crime scene. By 2008, Gannon and Duarte claimed over 40 drownings of white, athletic, college-aged men across 11 Midwest states, including Chris Jenkins, were linked. They pointed to recurring smiley face symbols near recovery sites, suggesting a coordinated group targeting victims after nights of drinking. That theory gained a lot of national attention through their media tours, with the two claiming gang initiations or jealousy as potential motives. But the authorities dismissed them. Even the FBI found no evidence of serial killings. Despite this, families of victims like Jenkins pressured Minnesota officials to reclassify his death as a homicide in 2006. In 2019, St. Cloud State professor Lee Gilbertson revived interest in the theory, alleging drugging and organized drownings were commonplace in these cases. To this day, nobody knows if the smiley face killer exists or if it's all just a very convenient coincidence. Rhode Island. Vampires. Between 1883 and 1892, an 18-year-old Rhode Island woman named Mercy Brown was caught in the middle of a tuberculosis outbreak in her local community. Mercy had to watch as TB claimed the lives of her mother Mary, her sister Mary Olive, and finally, Mercy herself. Months after her burial, her brother Edwin also fell ill with the disease. But at that time, locals didn't have our understanding of how TB worked. The belief of that time was that TB was largely caused by supernatural forces, so locals demanded that the dead Browns be dug up to identify the vampire draining Edwin's health. On March 17, 1892, villagers exhumed 3 bodies, but while Mercy's mother and sister showed the expected decomposition, Mercy's corpse, which was buried during winter just months earlier, appeared unusually preserved, with blood in her heart and hair reportedly grown post-mortem. These signs, which we now understand as natural effects of cold temperatures and TB-related tissue changes, convinced the group that she was one of the undead. They removed her heart and liver, burned them on a nearby rock, and fed Edwin the ashes in a medicinal tonic. He died 2 months later from his illness. But the locals continued this ritual for the rest of their lives. Mississippi. Curtis Flowers case. On July 16, 1996, a retired employee arrived at Tardy Furniture in Winona, Mississippi to find the dead bodies of 4 employees, shot execution style in the store's showroom. Investigators quickly found 5 .380 caliber shell casings and bullets matching a gun stolen from the car of Curtis Flowers' uncle earlier that day. Curtis Flowers was a 26-year-old black man briefly employed at Tardy Furniture 13 days prior, making him the sole suspect. Investigators believed that he had committed the murders as revenge for his firing, though those in the company said that he was never actually fired. So the authorities came to believe he had committed the act out of impulse. They found gunpowder residue on Flowers' hands, which he claimed was a result of handling fireworks, and a shoe print match. Only for all of this so-called evidence, there was no weapon, DNA, or fingerprints tying him to the scene. And the shoe print was disputed by those who worked at the company. Flowers faced 6 trials between 1997 and 2010, all prosecuted by Doug Evans. 4 convictions, which resulted in death sentences, were overturned for misconduct on Doug Evans' part, including his blatant exclusion of black jurors. 2 trials ended in hung juries. In the 6 trials, 2010 conviction was reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2019, which cited racial bias in jury selection. In September 2020, Mississippi's Attorney General dismissed all charges, citing unreliable witnesses, undisclosed alternative suspects, and insufficient evidence. Flowers, who always maintained his innocence, was released after nearly 23 years incarcerated. Yet the case remains unsolved. Level 4. Oregon. The Cowden family. On September 1st, 1974, Richard Cowden, his wife Belinda, and their children David and Melissa vanished during a camping trip near Carberry Creek, Oregon. The family had made an unplanned stop at the Rogue River National Forest campground after Richard's truck broke down. Security footage captured their last confirmed sighting when Richard and David purchased milk at the Copper General Store around 9 a.m. But when the family failed to arrive for dinner at Belinda's mother's home, she came to find them and found their campsite abandoned. Belinda's purse, Richard's wallet containing cash, their truck keys, and other personal items remained untouched. For the next 7 months, a huge search saw Oregon State Police, National Guard units, and hundreds of volunteers chasing every lead, but they found nothing. Then, on April 12, 1975, hikers found Richard's decomposed body tied to a tree approximately 7 miles from the campsite. Belinda, David, and Melissa were discovered soon after in a nearby cave concealed behind rocks. Belinda and David had died from .22 caliber gunshot wounds, while Melissa suffered fatal blunt force trauma. Richard's cause of death remained undetermined due to decomposition of his corpse. Authorities focused on Dwayne Lee Little, a paroled murderer who frequented the area and was the only suspect. Yet despite circumstantial evidence, including witness accounts of his presence and a .22 caliber Marlin rifle component found at his home, no charges were filed. The case remains unsolved, with no murder weapon recovered and conflicting timelines about the cave's accessibility during initial searches. How any of this happened, who did it, why, we'll never know. West Virginia, coal mines. In the late 19th century, West Virginia's coal industry was surging. Railroads like the Chesapeake in Ohio and Norfolk and Western were linking remote coal fields to national markets, bringing in a lot of money. By 1917, production exploded, employing over 90,000 miners, many of them immigrants and black workers. But safety was secondary, partly because it cost money to keep people safe, which meant that West Virginia mines had the nation's highest death rates, with World War I-era miners actually facing deadlier odds than the soldiers on the front line in Europe. And that's before we factor in the disasters. The 1907 Monongah explosion killed 362 miners, becoming America's deadliest mine disaster in history, followed by the 1914 Eccles blast, which killed 174. The 1924 Benwood disaster, which took out another 119 fatalities. The continuing disasters were mostly fueled by methane gas and coal dust, and further exacerbated by lax ventilation and safety violations. In 1968, the American government finally decided to make actual safety reforms, which did absolutely nothing thanks to corporate negligence. But all of these disasters left lingering spirits. Miners were reporting seeing shadowy figures darting through tunnels before equipment malfunctions, others describing a headless ghost dubbed Big John haunting Grant Town's Federal No. 1 mine. He was said to be a Russian immigrant who could predict collapses. In the 1940s, a mysterious lantern light spotted near Montcole foreshadowed a fatal explosion, cementing local belief that Big John was in town trying to save the locals. Idaho, Thomas Creech. In November 1974, Thomas Creech was hitchhiking through Idaho with his girlfriend, Carol Ann Spaulding. After accepting a ride from house painter Edward Thomas Arnold and John Wayne Bradford, Creech shot both men in the head with a rifle execution style and dumped their bodies. The couple stole the victim's Buick and committed a series of Bonnie and Clyde-style armed robberies before their arrest in Glens Ferry 2 days later. But when he was held in custody, Creech confessed to more murders, 42 in total across multiple states, though investigators corroborated only 9. However, he claimed to be linked to shootings, stabbings, and beatings that the authorities didn't even know about. When they delved deeper, authorities traced his movements through stolen credit cards and fingerprints, securing 5 convictions. But even in prison, he wasn't done. While serving a life sentence for the Idaho murders, Creech bludgeoned disabled inmate David Dale Jensen to death in 1981 using a battery-filled sock. A judge cited 5 aggravating factors in reinstating his death penalty, including the calculated nature of Jensen's killing. Despite a failed execution attempt in February 2024 and a postponed November 2024 date, Creech remains Idaho's longest-serving death row inmate. South Dakota, Wounded Knee Massacre. On December 29, 1890, U.S. Army soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regime massacred at least 250 Lakota men, women, and children near Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. The violence erupted during a forced disarmament of Chief Spotted Elk's band of Miniconjou and Hunkpapa Lakota, who had surrendered under military escort days earlier. Troops surrounded the camp with 4 rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns trained on the group, leaving them with no way out. But as soldiers confiscated weapons, a struggle broke out. Black Coyote, a deaf Lakota man, resisted handing over his rifle. The gun discharged during the altercation, kickstarting the chaos. Cavalry troops immediately opened fire at close range into the largely disarmed crowd. Survivors fled as soldiers pursued them, using Hotchkiss artillery to massacre those hiding in a nearby ravine. Witness accounts describe soldiers methodically killing wounded individuals, including a 10-year-old boy executed at point-blank range. The slaughter lasted less than an hour. Frozen bodies littered the snow, many stripped of clothing by looters. Official reports listed 150 to 300 Lakota dead, with modern estimates leaning toward the higher figure. Approximately 2/3 were women and children. The armor awarded 20 medals of honor for the action, showing absolutely no remorse for the massacre of the innocents. South Carolina, Murdaugh family murders. On July 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh called 911 to report finding his wife Maggie and son Paul fatally shot at their South Carolina hunting estate in the kennels while he was in the house napping. But when the investigators started looking into the case, they discovered that it was not so clear-cut. A Snapchat video Paul recorded at 8:44 p.m. near the crime scene captured Alex's voice minutes before the murders, contradicting his claim he was elsewhere. Cell phone data and vehicle GPS further placed him at the location around 8:50 p.m., the estimated time of death. When confronted with his lies, Alex said that his opioid addiction left him with paranoid thinking. During his 6-week trial, prosecutors highlighted how his $9 million embezzlement from his clients and his law firm was exposed on the murder day. His investors were furious at his crimes, and he needed a distraction. Killing his wife and children would be a major distraction, and it would also allow him to secure a $10 million life insurance payout. But Alex's legal career collapsed as details emerged of his decade-long fraud schemes, drug addiction, and obstruction of justice came to the surface during his trial. Jurors convicted him on March 2, 2023, after less than 3 hours of deliberation. He received 2 consecutive life sentences for murder and a 40-year federal sentence for financial crimes. Arizona, the Pied Piper of Tucson. In mid-1960s Tucson, 23-year-old Charles Howard Schmidt Jr. managed to build an incredibly mythic persona among local teens. Standing at just 5'3", he stuffed tin cans and rags into leather boots to appear taller, dyed his hair jet black, and wore pancake makeup with white lipstick to emulate Elvis Presley. He started spinning tales of mafia ties and claimed expertise in 100 sexual techniques, drawing loyal followers to follow the Pied Piper of Tucson. On May 31, 1964, Schmidt recruited his girlfriend Mary French and his friend John Saunders to lure 15-year-old Aline Rowe to the desert under the guise of a double date. There, he bludgeoned her with rocks and buried her in a shallow grave while French waited in the car and cooked up an alibi. 1 year later, Schmidt strangled 17-year-old Gretchen Fritz and her 13-year-old sister Wendy leaving their bodies partially buried. He bragged about the murders to his confidant Richard Bruns, even claiming animals had scavenged Rowe's remains. All of this thrilled him, and he was getting away with it. Bruns initially stayed silent, adhering to street codes of loyalty, but he was cracking, concerned that Schmid would kill his own girlfriend. Knowing that Bruns posed a major threat to his reign, Schmid threatened him during a mob-linked kidnapping to keep quiet. Of course, that just convinced Bruns to contact police and expose his friend's crimes. Even though Rowe's body remained missing for another 2 years, forensic evidence from her skull fracture secured Schmid's 1966 conviction and death sentence. But he would be stabbed 47 times in 1975 by 2 fellow prisoners, killing him before he got close to execution. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. When he was a child in Chicago, John Wayne Gacy endured an abusive childhood under an alcoholic father who derided him as dumb and queer. When he got older, he took a job in a Las Vegas mortuary where he later described embracing a corpse. But when he returned to Illinois, he was hiding a secret. He had been convicted for assaulting and raping a young teen boy, and he wanted to do it more. By 1972, he had established a construction business but was spending more time targeting vulnerable young men. Posing as a contractor or fake police officer, Gacy lured victims to his Norwood Park home with job offers or intimidation. Using a handcuff trick to restrain them, he raped and tortured his victims before strangling them with ropes or suffocating them with rags. 26 bodies were buried in his crawl space, others dumped in Illinois Des Plaines River. Yet despite neighborhood complaints about odors and suspicions from employees, Gacy evaded scrutiny for 6 years by leveraging his community ties, including performing as Pogo the Clown at charity events. He thought nobody could possibly have suspected a clown of being a killer. But on December 11th, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peist disappeared after meeting Gacy about a construction job. Police began investigating and found that he told his mom he would be heading to meet Gacy. Surveillance teams observed him acting erratically, and during a search, officers discovered human remains under his house, confirming their suspicions. After confessing to 33 murders, Gacy was convicted in March 1980 following testimony from survivor Jeff Rignall, who detailed being chloroformed and murdered. Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, his case becoming one of America's most extensive serial murder investigations. Virginia, Golden Years Murders. Between 1990 and 1996, at least 13 elderly women were murdered in Richmond, Virginia, sparking fears of a serial killer. The first 6 victims, all black women aged 61 to 89, were stabbed in their homes, with the crimes initially linked by similar entry methods and a lack of forced entry. But by 1996, the pattern had expanded to include 6 more victims, all white women, all killed by blunt force trauma or strangulation, their bodies often doused in chemicals to prevent DNA evidence. Investigators had spent years looking for anything they could grab onto, but the killers had been extremely good at covering their tracks. In 1999, investigators focused on Leslie Burchard, a homeless, schizophrenic man serving life for 3 unrelated murders. Burchard confessed to 4 Golden Years killings, describing crime scene details investigators later claimed were never public. But no physical evidence tied him to the scenes, and he took back his story before his 2002 death, saying he wanted to escape questioning. Retired Detective Ron Reed later suggested that Burchard probably committed other murders they don't know about, but the investigation fractured over conflicting evidence. Early stabbings were very different from later beatings. The victim demographics were constantly shifting, and Burchard's documented mental illness made him highly unreliable. Despite his confessions, forensic gaps and the absence of biological links left doubts about his involvement in all 13 deaths. As of 2025, most cases remain open, with unresolved questions about whether there were multiple perpetrators or one evolving killer. Tennessee, McCamey Manor. McCamey Manor, an extremely haunted attraction operating in Somerton, Tennessee, is not your typical haunted house ride. Founded by Russ McCamey, a Navy veteran and former actor, the attraction requires guests to sign a 40-page waiver detailing risks such as waterboarding, forced ingestion of unknown substances, dental extractions without anesthesia, and temporary burial before they're allowed to enter. The experience is marked as a 10-hour tour and involves actors physically restraining guests, simulating drowning, administering non-lethal electric shocks, and employing sensory deprivation tactics. Former participants report being bound, gagged, and subjected to hypnosis-like mind games tailored specifically to their phobias. No one has ever completed the full experience, and critics allege staff sometimes ignore withdrawal requests. Tennessee authorities investigated McCamey Manor in 2023 following allegations in the Hulu documentary Monster Inside, which depicted the attraction as a torture chamber. McCamey himself has faced attempted murder and domestic assault charges in July 2024 related to incidents on his property. Yet, despite ongoing legal scrutiny and public backlash, the attraction remains operational with a reported 27,000-person waitlist. Texas. Henry Lee Lucas. In 1960, Henry Lee Lucas was imprisoned for the murder of his mother. But this was just the first in a lifetime of murders on his route to becoming one of America's most infamous serial killers. In 1983, while in prison in Texas, Lucas told authorities that he had committed hundreds of unsolved murders across the U.S., and he was ready to confess to his impressive body count. Law enforcement, including the Texas Rangers, formed a task force to validate his confessions, which spanned at least 28 states. Lucas described gruesome details of crimes from stabbing to decapitations, and authorities soon closed over 200 cases attributed to him. He was so helpful and cooperative with the authorities that they granted him perks like restaurant meals and unrestricted movement within police stations, bolstering his credibility. By 1985, Lucas's tally of confessed murders ballooned to 600, with police accepting his accounts despite increasingly glaring inconsistencies. To name two, he had claimed responsibility for a 1981 Houston homicide while jailed in Maryland, and a 1975 Texas murder while working in Pennsylvania. 3 inconsistencies led journalists to dig deeper into what was going on, and that's when they uncovered a serious problem. Lucas had been fed case files to refresh his memory, essentially giving him false information to help police close more cases despite a lack of physical evidence. Polygraph tests and employment records also contradicted his timelines, revealing that he was constantly lying. Ultimately, only 3 killings can be confirmed to have been committed by Lucas: his mother, girlfriend Becky Powell, and landlady Kate Rich. But the damage endured, with cleared cases remaining officially closed in many jurisdictions, despite the knowledge that they were not committed by him. Level 5. Colorado. The Galvin family. In 1960s Colorado Springs, the Galvin family, made up of parents Don and Mimi with their 12 children, became a grim case study in mental illness. 6 of their sons developed schizophrenia, their condition marked by escalating violence and psychosis. The eldest, Donald, first exhibited disturbing behavior at Colorado State University, jumping into a bonfire and dismembering a cat before attempting to murder his wife, leading to his schizophrenia diagnosis. The others were no less violent. Brian fatally stabbed his girlfriend in California, then killed himself. Jim, diagnosed later, sexually abused his younger sisters and died from a medication overdose in 2001. Peter experienced violent outbursts, once requiring police intervention after attacking family members, and was later found strapped to a urine-soaked hospital bed. Joseph reported voices and skyward apparitions, while Matthew believed he was Paul McCartney. The brothers' conditions were so severe that they were each cycled through state hospitals, subjected to shock therapies and sedatives that further isolated the family from one another. The police were constantly called to the home as the fights among the 10 brothers often turned physical and violent. Researchers later identified a gene mutation in the affected siblings and their mother, linking genetics to their shared conditions. But the boys had their own share of trauma, including abuse by a trusted priest, and Jim, which raises more questions about their condition. Washington. Jake Bird. A transient laborer with a criminal history spanning burglary and assault was arrested in Tacoma, Washington in October 1947 after neighbors reported screams from the Cludd residence. When they got to the scene, officers found Bertha Cludd and her daughter Beverly June brutally murdered with an axe. Bird was in the process of fleeing and slashed 2 officers with a knife before being subdued. He confessed to the killings, claiming a burglary attempt escalated into violence when confronted, though evidence suggested an assault motive. Convicted in a 3-day trial, Bird was sentenced to death on December 6, 1947. During sentencing, he denounced his legal representation and declared, "All you guys who had anything to do with this case are going to die before I do." Nobody took him seriously, but then things started to happen. Pierce County Superior Court Judge Edward D. Hodge suffered a fatal heart attack within a month. Others involved in the case died within a year of the so-called curse. Tacoma police officer John Hickey, Under Sheriff Joseph Carpatch, a prison guard, court clerk Charles Piers, and defense attorney J.W. Selden, who died of pneumonia on the trial's first anniversary. Bird confessed to 44 murders nationwide, of which 11 were confirmed. He was executed on July 15, 1949, and buried in an unmarked grave at Walla Walla State Penitentiary. Iowa. Villisca Axe Murders. On June 10, 1912, in Villisca, Iowa, Mary Peckham noticed that her neighbors, the Moore family, were mysteriously absent from their usual morning chores. She immediately went to their house to check on them. She never expected the scene she discovered. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 visiting Stillinger sisters had been bludgeoned to death with an axe while sleeping. Investigators found the weapon, Josiah's own axe, left in the guest bedroom alongside a 4-pound slab of bacon from the icebox. Bloody water on the kitchen table and a gas lamp with its wick dimmed suggested the killer washed up and used minimal light to conceal his brutal killings. All mirrors were covered with cloths, and 2 used cigarettes in the attic pointed to the killer hiding there before the attack, possibly for hours, waiting for his moment to strike. Lena Stillinger showed defensive wounds and possible sexual interference, though later investigations questioned that conclusion. The killer struck all of the victims with the axe's blunt side, except Sarah, who suffered undeniable blade wounds. The authorities looked to a number of suspects with credible motives for the murders, including Josiah's business rival, a transient preacher, and a serial killer linked to similar axe murders. But, despite 2 trials and federal claims tying these suspects to the crimes, no convictions resulted. Over 112 years later, the case remains unsolved. Wisconsin. Ed Gain. Ed Gain was raised on his family's remote Plainfield farm, shaped by a domineering religious mother who instilled a deep-rooted fear of sin and women's immorality. After his father's death and his brother Henry's suspicious demise linked to a fire Ed allegedly caused, his mental state unraveled. But when his mother died in 1945, he descended into full-blown psychosis, preserving her bedroom as a shrine while the rest of their home decayed and rotted. By 1947, Gain began exhuming female corpses from local cemeteries, fashioning macabre trophies from their skin and bones, including masks, chair upholstery, and a belt of human nipples. Within a matter of years, his bizarre fixations escalated to murder, killing hardware store owner Bernice Warden and hiding her remains in his shed. For 3 years, rumors swirled about her disappearance until a hardware store owner vanished. Witnesses recall seeing Gain at her shop, and when police investigated, they found her decapitated body in his shed, strung up and gutted. A search of Gain's home revealed human heads used as soup bowls, organs sitting in the refrigerator, and at least 15 victims' remains scattered, some stolen from graves, others from murders. He confessed to killing the 2 women, but claimed most body parts were sourced from cemeteries. Declared legally insane in 1958, he spent his life in psychiatric institutions until his 1984 death. Gain's farmhouse, torched by outraged locals in 1958, became part of the local folklore, cementing his sinister legacy. Wyoming, Hot Springs death. In Wyoming, Yellowstone National Park's hot springs have claimed at least 22 lives since 1890. And the victims are all over, ranging from children to adults who underestimated the lethal combination of scalding temperatures and unstable ground. In 1890, 7-year-old James Joseph Stumbo wandered from his family and fell into a hot spring near Old Faithful, becoming the first recorded fatality. Over a century later, in 2016, 23-year-old Colin Scott died after slipping into a 93 degrees Celsius acidic pool. Rangers abandoned recovery efforts within hours as his body dissolved in the boiling corrosive water, a grim outcome captured on his sister's phone before she alerted authorities. The incidents led to increased warnings throughout the park, but guests continue to ignore them. In July 2022, 70-year-old Il Hun Ro entered the Abyss Hot Spring at West Thumb Geyser Basin. Only a shoe and partial remains were found weeks later. The park's fragile crust, often thin as a skiff of ice, masks subterranean boiling water, creating hidden hazards. Recovery missions are frequently halted due to safety concerns for responders, meaning that those who slip in are lost almost instantly. But historical records show recurring patterns: unsupervised children, hikers veering off trails, and thrill seekers testing thermal pools. And all of them end up with serious injuries or worse. Level 6. Massachusetts, Jolly Jane. Jane Topin's nursing career began in 1885 at Cambridge Hospital, where she earned the nickname Jolly Jane for her apparent warmth towards patients. But behind this sunny facade, she conducted lethal experiments, altering morphine and atropine dosages to study their effects, a practice that led to a lot of patient deaths. Her coworkers did not trust her. They believed she was stealing and doing who knows what behind closed doors. But regardless of their suspicions, she secured roles at Massachusetts General Hospital and later as a private nurse, forging recommendations to get ahead. Then in 1895, Jane began her career as a killer. Using her knowledge of medicine, Jane poisoned her landlord, Israel Dunham, and found a new joy in harming those who were too vulnerable to stop it. Over the next 6 years, she targeted elderly patients, friends, and family, using poison to induce their prolonged suffering, which she later admitted gave her a thrill. And the whole time, she evaded detection by exploiting her medical authority, falsifying records, and moving between institutions. But in 1901, she had gone too far. Jane had wiped out almost all of the Davis family in Katamet, Massachusetts. Authorities were highly suspicious of how an entire family could die in similar ways with seemingly no clear cause. When the autopsies revealed morphine poisoning, Jane was arrested. In 1902, she confessed to 31 murders, but later admitted it may well have been over 100. She was ultimately declared legally insane, avoiding prison through lifelong commitment to Taunton Insane Hospital. Nevada, Las Vegas shooting. Stephen Paddock, a 64-year-old retired accountant and high-stakes gambler, arrived at his 32nd floor suite at Las Vegas's Mandalay Bay Resort on October 1st, 2017, with one mission: to cause as much harm as he possibly could. Far below him, the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival was unfolding, And when the moment was right, Stephen used 23 rifles, including 14 modified with bump stocks to mimic automatic fire, and fired over 1,000 rounds into the crowd in 11 minutes before ending his own life. He killed 58 people and injured nearly 900. The attack remains the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. Stephen meticulously planned the massacre over months. He booked Mandalay Bay suites overlooking the festival 6 days before his attack, smuggled weapons in 10 suitcases with hotel staff's assistance, and installed cameras to monitor hallway activity. It took 72 minutes before law enforcement were able to breach Stephen's room, an excruciatingly slow response that could have been devastating had the killer not ended his own life. But even after a full investigation, the FBI concluded no ideological or financial motive, leaving his real intentions a mystery. Delaware, Route 40 killer. Stephen Brian Pennell, Delaware's only documented serial killer, terrorized Route 40 between 1987 and 1988, targeting women he encountered along the highway. Posing as a client, the married electrician lured workers and hitchhikers to his blue Ford van, which he'd outfitted with blue carpeting. Once the victims were inside, Stephen revealed his hidden kit of pliers, whips, duct tape, and knives. He bound his victims' wrists and ankles, then subjected them to prolonged sadistic attacks, crushing breasts with pliers, mutilating bodies with hammers, and strangling them before discarding their remains near wooded highways. Authorities linked the crimes through blue carpet fibers found on victim Catherine DeMauro's body. Now aware there was a killer roaming Route 40 for victims, prompting a multi-agency task force to deploy undercover officers along Route 40. On September 14, 1988, rookie officer Renee Tashner, posing as a worker, encountered Pennell's van. She declined to enter but covertly collected carpet fibers during their conversation and recorded his license plate. Forensic analysis matched the fibers to DeMauro's case, triggering 24/7 surveillance of their suspect. Pennell's erratic late-night drives along the route heightened suspicions. A traffic stop on September 30th allowed police to search his van, revealing bloodstains, victims' hair, and the tools. Fiber comparisons and physical evidence solidified the case, leading to his November 1988 arrest. Authorities went on to search his property, uncovering rolls of duct tape identical to that used on victims, sealing his connection to at least 5. In 1989, Pennell was found guilty of and handed 2 life sentences. Indiana, radiation experiments. In 1927, school officials at Lyles Consolidated School in rural Indiana informed parents of a new opportunity for their children: a free medical treatment at the county hospital to address scalp conditions. 10 African-American students, including 5-year-old Vertus Hardiman, who wasn't yet formally enrolled, boarded a bus under the guise of receiving care for ringworm. Parents signed consent forms approving their children to receive treatments, but the consent form omitted some critical details. The procedure involved direct radiation exposure to the children's scalps through untested X-ray equipment. These children were not being treated for ringworm. They were being experimented on. And for Vertus, he had been given too much. Immediate reactions included severe headaches, dizziness, and scalp burns. Within weeks, all permanently lost their hair, with Vertus developing progressive skull necrosis that required him to conceal his head under hats and wigs for life. Medical records later revealed the U.S. government sanctioned the tests as part of Cold War-era research on radiation's biological effects. No long-term health monitoring or compensation was provided, though Hardiman's disfigurement became a documented case study. The children's families spent decades unaware their relatives had been unwitting participants in a classified radiation experiment. Vertus died in 2007 at 85, having endured chronic pain and social isolation his whole life. His wound had become cancerous, a tragic end to a life he had suffered through. Level 7. Georgia. Samuel Little. Samuel Little, born in Reynolds, Georgia, became the most prolific confirmed serial killer in U.S. history. At the beginning of his criminal career in 1970, he was nothing more than a petty thief who escalated to violent assaults, but he repeatedly evaded serious consequences, despite over 100 arrests for crimes like kidnapping and rape. Part of the reason he got away with it for so long was that Little targeted marginalized women, sex workers, drug addicts, and others in high-crime areas, strangled them to death, and often leaving their bodies in alleys, dumpsters, or remote locations. Many victims' deaths were initially misclassified as overdoses or accidents and nothing more. But in 2012, Los Angeles police matched his DNA to 3 1980s cold cases after arresting him on a Kentucky drug warrant. Soon realizing they had a serial killer on their hands, Little was convicted in 2014 and sentenced to life. But he remained uncooperative until 2018 when Texas Ranger James Holland secured his trust during 700 hours of interviews. Finally, Samuel Little revealed everything, using his photographic memory for a good reason, even drawing images of his victims. Dozens of murders across 19 states, at least 60 confirmed, though he confessed to 93 between 1970 and 2005. Little died in prison in December 2020, leaving a trail of unresolved confessions and unanswered questions about other murders. Florida, Gainesville Ripper. In August 1990, the Gainesville Ripper murdered 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida during a 3-day killing spree. He broke into apartments using a screwdriver, assaulted 3 victims, tied them up, and killed them in extremely violent ways before posing their bodies in macabre displays. There was no evidence to link anyone to the killings, leaving the authorities with a serious challenge. Their only suspect was Ed Humphrey, a University of Florida student with mental health issues, but there was no evidence to tie him to the murders. But in November 1990, Louisiana resident Cindy Jurasik had heard about all the killings and immediately suspected a young man from her church, Danny Rolling. Danny had made some concerning comments to Cindy's then-husband, confessing that he liked to stick knives into people. While she initially didn't believe that he was capable of killing, Cindy reported the suspicion to Crime Stoppers. DNA testing confirmed his blood matched that found at the scene, as well as his semen. Additional evidence from his campsite, including a screwdriver, blood-stained pants, and audio diaries, solidified the case. Cindy had unintentionally stopped a serial killer. Rolling confessed to all 5 murders in 1994, pleading guilty to avoid a trial. He was executed by lethal injection in 2006. Nebraska, Heartbeat Bridge. Back in the early 20th century, the Portal School, later known as Hatchet House, was a one-room schoolhouse in Papillion, Nebraska. It was said that a teacher allegedly lost her mind, decapitating each of her students one by one and removing their hearts. She took them to a nearby bridge and discarded their hearts in the water below. People who visit the Heartbeat Bridge, as it later became known, have been said to see a shadowy female figure believed to be the spirit of the teacher returning to the scene of her most gruesome crime. But there's also the claim that those who walk the bridge after dark hear the rhythmic sound of heartbeats or whispers, as though the organs are still alive and active even after all this time. Paranormal investigators come from all over the U.S. to try and confirm whether or not the claims are true, and have confirmed the heartbeat sounds. Missouri, Kansas City Butcher. Robert Andrew Bardea Jr. was a flea market vendor in Missouri with a dark, dark secret. He was the Kansas City Butcher, the sinister figure kidnapping, torturing, and murdering men. His methods included prolonged captivity for up to 6 weeks, combined with electrical shocks, bone breaking, throat injections of drain cleaner, and meticulous keeping of journals of each act in handwritten logs. And his victims had no idea what they were getting into. Bardea lured victims through offers of shelter, rides, or bail assistance, often targeting vulnerable individuals like 19-year-old Jerry Howell, whom he drugged and to death in 1984. Once they were dead, Bardea dismembered victims with a saw, disposing of remains in garbage bags while retaining body parts as trophies. On March 29, 1988, he abducted 22-year-old Christopher Bryson, a sex worker. 4 days later, Bryson was forced through the that Bardea loved, including ammonia-swabbed eyes and forced silence via Drano injections. But Bryson broke the pattern. Bryson escaped. During his captivity, he had noticed matches left behind by Bardea. Managing to grab them, he used the matches to burn through his restraints and leap from a second-story window despite a broken foot. He immediately went to the cops, exposing Bardea's twisted reign of terror. Authorities promptly investigated, recovering 2 human skulls, vertebrae, a blood-stained chainsaw, and 334 Polaroids depicting sessions during a search of Bardea's Hyde Park home. The investigation confirmed that between 1984 and 1987, Bardea kidnapped and murdered at least 6 men. Facing overwhelming evidence, Bardea pleaded guilty to 6 murders in 1988, receiving life imprisonment without parole. He died of a heart attack in 1992. Maryland. Joe Metheny. Joseph Roy Metheny was one of Maryland's most notorious serial killers, taking advantage of Baltimore's seedy underbelly of addiction and homelessness. Exploiting his access to a secluded trailer near a southwest Baltimore pallet yard, he preyed on marginalized women, many of whom were sex workers or battling substance abuse. He would lure them in with drugs or shelter before and murdering them. But by 1996, he was bored of the pattern and wanted to do something even more extreme. He began dismembering victims' bodies, storing flesh in Tupperware containers, allegedly mixing it with pork and beef to sell as barbecue sandwiches at a roadside stand. He later told investigators, "No one can tell the difference between human and pork meat when they're combined," explaining how he got away with it for so long. But in December 1996, Rita Kemper escaped his trailer after an attempted rape and alerted police of what he was doing. When detectives arrived at the trailer, they discovered the remains of Kimberly Spicer and Kathy Magaziner, 2 sex workers Metheny admitted stabbing and bludgeoning. While convicted of these 2 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment, Metheny confessed to at least 10 killings, though there was no physical evidence to confirm whether or not they happened. If you haven't had your fill of disturbing content yet, check out this video of Disturbing Encounters.